I'm joined today by Governor Jeb Bush. Having served as governor of Florida between 1999 and 2007, Governor Bush's lineage is a distinctly political one. His father, George H.W. Bush, served as President of the United States from 1989 to 1993, and his brother, George W. Bush, from 2001 to 2009. A vocal advocate for immigration reform and lower taxes, Governor Bush unsuccessfully sought the Republican nomination for the presidency in 2016. He remains a critic of President Donald Trump ever since. Governor Bush, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's very, very exciting to be hosting you.
Thank you. I feel so bad. I've been invited to be with you all in person for maybe like the last 10 years, and we finally do it virtually. Perhaps one of these days I'll be able to go back to your beautiful campus.
Fingers crossed when everything's back to normal. I wanted to start off today by taking us back to your early life. Of course, it goes without saying that politics was a key part of your childhood. You were, I think, 11 years old when your father, former President George H.W. Bush, first ran for office, and 14 when he was elected to the House of Representatives. Could you tell us about the impact this had on your childhood and your politics going forward?
Well, when I grew up, I was born in Midland, Texas, and we moved to Houston. I didn't know my dad was interested in politics. We had a fairly idyllic childhood. Lots of go to school, get home. We couldn't come inside. We had to play till we got tired. Had dinner, did our homework, went to sleep. And we were a close-knit family. We talked about baseball a lot more than politics. Even to the point where after my dad did get elected to the Congress, I was in high school by then, and we still, throughout his political career, politics wasn't the organizing principle of our family life. My mom and dad taught us to be humble, that we weren't special, that we weren't different than anybody else, and we acted that way. It was a pretty normal childhood in that regard. Blessed because I had two parents that loved me with their heart and soul, but my brothers and sister, we grew up in a kind of a traditional, nice way.
When did politics start becoming a part of your life then?
Yeah, so I got married when I was 21 and 2 weeks. I fell in love with my wife, Columba, now of 47 years, when I was in high school. And I met her in Mexico. I literally fell in love at first sight. Took me 2 years to convince her that she loved me, but I finally was successful in that regard. And we went to live in Venezuela. I graduated from college, University of Texas, in 2 years. I started working for a bank, and when I was 24, I went to Caracas, Venezuela, with my two little kids and my wife. And my dad was announced he was running for president in 1979, and I called him up and I said, "It's payback time. I want to help you." So it wasn't because I had like a burning desire to be involved in politics. It was, I love my dad, and he'd been so good to me as a father. I thought maybe this was a time that I could pay him back a little bit. So I worked for 18 months in that campaign. And you've been involved in politics, I'm sure you know. It's kind of weird. It's kind of goofy. They're strange people that migrate towards politics. I don't know why. And it's different. And what I found was I overcame all my trepidations about it. I campaigned in 45 states. I learned how to speak. I overcame a lot of anxiety about doing that. And so I was more open to public service after that. Was Secretary of Commerce of the state of Florida in 1987, I think it was. And I saw firsthand the role of governors in political life and policy making, in service. And my motivation really was focused on being governor after that.
So you've spoken kind of very extensively about the great influence your father had on your life before his passing in 2018. Could you tell us about the specific political values and lessons that you've inherited from him and the legacy that he's left behind for the United States?
Well, his legacy is thankfully being acknowledged a lot more now than it was when he was president, which is typical, I guess. History is always kinder to people that are in the arena. His impact on me has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with decency, honor, integrity, courage, virtues that, right now we're in a kind of a world where there's an idea that somehow, well, you're imposing my values, your values on me. But in fact, there are timeless absolute truths, basically, in life. It's better to be honest than to be lying. It's better to be courageous than to be a coward. It's better to show integrity and compassion than to do the opposite. And so my dad lived a life of virtue. And so it was, let me put it this way. He was an incredible father, and my mom was pretty cool too. So a lot of times when you're growing up and you have these, well-known parents that are extraordinary, it's very difficult. And a lot of children have a hard time adjusting to that. I figured I was about 25 years old, and I realized if I could be half the man my dad was, that would be a pretty fulfilled life. And so I kind of lowered expectations of my own aspirations, not to try to achieve the greatness of my dad. And it made me, I've lived a pretty fulfilling life because of it. I don't have all those psychological hangups that a lot of children of famous people have. I'm totally blessed to be my dad's son. And his legacy on the broader scale is very similar in terms of the generosity of spirit that he showed each and every day. But I think he'll also go down as one of the great foreign policy presidents in the modern era. You weren't around then, but in 1989 to 1992, there was incredible turbulence in the world. The Iraqis had invaded Kuwait. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Noriega in Panama was a drug tyrant, creating instability in the Panama Canal, which was of strategic interest to the United States. A whole slew of things were going on, and the fall of the Soviet Union being perhaps the biggest. And my dad's leadership was extraordinary. He built a great team. He trusted them. He communicated to the rest of the world. He had personal relationships with all the leaders. He built coalitions that would seem so foreign today. He was an extraordinary leader, and his leadership style was perfect for the complexity of the times.
Your father worked very, very closely as well in China and shaped the US foreign policy towards China at the time. What do you think he would make of the situation today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think he wouldn't have clinged to the idea that, the China that he dealt with was a China that was emerging from total deprivation, total poverty. He was the first, he was the head of the liaison office before we actually recognized China diplomatically. So he lived, my mom and he lived in China during a time that was radically different than today. And I think his views on China would have adjusted to the reality that China's aspirations now aren't to engage with the world. China's aspirations are much more mercantile, much more aggressive. They're accelerating a long-term strategic plan. And I think he would likely be someone who would say we need to engage with China for sure, but we need to challenge their aspirations. That the thought, and 20 years ago, the thought and the hope was that China would emerge as they opened up economically, they would open up politically, and that they would join the community of nations in respect for rule of law and human liberty and the values that typically are viewed as Western values. That's not the case anymore. The China model is the Chinese model, and while we should respect that, I think we need to challenge it when it confronts our own values. I think my dad would be a supporter of that.
So your family and their political roots were entrenched in Texas, whereas your political career took shape in Florida. Could you tell us a bit about your initial move to Florida in 1980 and how the politics there was different to that of Texas?
Well, as I said, I'd worked in my dad's campaign. I had to go back to work. I literally had no money. My wife we had a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old. And, again, politics wasn't what drove my life. It was, I got to get going here. And I incorrectly said, I don't want to be I don't want to be in my dad's shadow. I want to be my own man. That's not incorrect. I think that's a sincere motivation. But the incorrectness of it all was I thought, if I left Houston, where I grew up and where my dad was well known, that somehow I could escape his shadow, and which was foolish. I mean, he was vice president of the United States. I didn't think that went through very well. So, but the second motivation was my children spoke Spanish, not English, when they came back from Caracas. My wife is a Mexican American, proud Mexican of Mexican heritage. And at the time, Houston, which is dramatically different than today, Houston was a place that was not as welcoming of diversity as it is today. Today, it's one of the most amazing international cities with incredible diversity. Back then, it wasn't. And it was a subtle kind of thing, but it was something that I felt uncomfortable as a husband of a woman who I still adore and my children who I love. So I decided I wanted to move to Miami, where I had a business opportunity, because Miami is truly a bicultural, bilingual, very different city. Even today, it's 60% of people in Miami-Dade County were born outside the United States. I embraced that. That's what I wanted to live in, that kind of environment. And I'm glad I did. I think I personally love Miami. I think my children growing up here was a real benefit. Getting out from my dad's shadow thing, I had to figure out a different way of dealing with that than geography.
So you first ran for governor of Florida in 1994, losing to Democratic Governor Lawton Chiles. Could you tell us a bit about this campaign and the platform on which you ran, and how this prepared you eventually for your successful election in 1998?
That's a great question, because there was a lot of lessons learned. I lost at the time, the closest election for governor in Florida's history. And I was one of the few Republicans that lost in 1994. It was one of those wave elections. Mitt Romney lost against Ted Kennedy, and there was a candidate in California that lost, and I lost. Those are the main kind of large races. And the first lesson is it's better to run against a bad candidate than a good one. Lawton Chiles never lost in his entire political career. So I ran against a guy who had a great connection with people in the state. I lost probably because I didn't share who I was. I had a bunch of great ideas, at least in my mind. I thought they were great. And, had all these white papers. It was pretty, was a wave election where conservative principles were being expressed in all sorts of ways. And I was on the cutting edge of that, but I didn't share who I was first. So when I got attacked, I got attacked a lot, people didn't shrug their shoulders and say, I don't believe that. This guy's a good man. That's not true. And so the lessons in politics are you have to connect with people on a human level, on an emotional level, before you can offer up your 5-point plan to cure the common cold. I mean, basically, I didn't do that well. And the lesson was I still believed what I believed. And in 98, I ran again. And instead of talking about my white paper for education reform, I went to visit 250 schools in a year. I learned a lot. I kind of dehorned myself because I have pretty radical views about education and there's a lot of resistance to change in our public education system in the United States. But people said, hey, the guy's not that bad of a guy. He's showing up and he's asking questions and he's curious and he's listening. Maybe he isn't as radical or crazy as I thought he was. So the lessons of 94 directly helped me in 98. And I won. I ran against a good person for sure, but not a great candidate, which is the other lesson. Always run against a inferior candidate. You have a better chance of winning. And I told my story with a human context around it, which is, if you look at American political life today, there's very little of that. It's demonization. It's it's crazy. The political system has really, because of digital media, changing culture, all sorts of reasons, has really gotten quite ugly. But in 1998, you could run a campaign the way I did. I went to juvenile justice courts and sat with the judge listening to how he or she dealt with a 15-year-old kid that may have committed a atrocious crime, and his whole life might have been uh, redirected to a bad outcome, or the dependency courts, or drug treatment facilities, or programs for the developmentally disabled, or the schools, as I mentioned. So it was an incredible experience for me to be able to do that. I was lucky enough to have been successful in business so as to be able to take the time to run that kind of campaign. And it prepared me to be governor, for sure. It always reminded me why I was serving, because I had these experiences of dealing with literally thousands and thousands of people who needed a more effective government.
So your terms as governor were characterized by low taxes, small government, and an increase in Florida's state reserves from $1.3 billion to $9.8 billion. Could you tell us
Wow, you're the only person that knows that other than me.
Could you tell us a bit about the economic policy at the time and how you actually made this happen?
So when I got there, there hadn't been much of a challenge of how the budgets were created, how, we were not AAA bond rated, because back then you had to have all sorts of taxes, a broad-based system of taxation for people to think, well, this is, you tax enough things and eventually you're going to get your debt repaid. And I had to make the case that what we needed to do was to grow the economy, create the best business climate possible, grow the economy, and as the economy grew, the receipts to government would grow, and that we wouldn't spend more than what we had. So this will sound really nerdy, but we created policies restricting use of non-recurring monies for recurring obligations. Sounds like in a family budget, if you buy a car with one-time monies, then you don't have monies available to make the car payments. You aren't going to own the car very long. Well, that's kind of how government typically operates. And so we restricted the ability to use non-recurring monies on recurring obligations. We reserved every account had to have a 15% reserve. We created a budget stabilization fund. We fully funded the pension obligations. We did all these things that never really, as a matter of policy, had been done. It was done during good times, for sure, but it wasn't a matter of policy. And the result was, over time, and we had good economic conditions, over time, the state's fiscal situation evolved to the point where we were AAA bond rated. And, being a conservative, that warmed my heart. The press and liberals hated the fact that I was celebrating a better bond rating. I don't know why they didn't think that was a good thing, but we led the nation in job growth. We had the ability to cut $18 billion of taxes. I reduced the size of government, the number of employees, at least in government, by something like, I think it was 15,000 jobs or something. So we made government more efficient, and the economy's growth helped generate the receipts to allow us to have the kind of surpluses you described.
So you've always been very, very committed to education and education reform, as you just said earlier. And in 1995, you founded the Foundation for Florida's Future, and you still remain on its board of trustees. Could you tell us a bit about what this organization does?
Yeah, sure. Its sister organization is a national organization called Excel in Ed. And that foundation works with states, state by state, policymakers to create greater accountability, more school choice, higher expectations, higher standards, and the embrace of technology to be able to accelerate the learning experience. And so basically, we took the Florida experience, my tenure as governor, where we implemented many of the ideas I just described of robust accountability, school choice, both public and private, ending social promotion in third grade, which was a big deal, where if you're functionally illiterate by the end of third grade, all the research suggests that the learning gaps will grow exponentially. So we created interventions for early childhood literacy, and all of that, kind of the suite of reforms, we've tried to export to other states, and we've had some success doing it. It's been embraced by many states. And now we've enhanced that by advocating for, and this is a time where, we're doing this virtually. A lot of classrooms in America today, millions of students are being taught virtually as well. And so we've long advocated for virtual learning, but in a blended format. So you can imagine that time was the variable and learning was the constant rather than the other way around. And you can harness technology to be able to make that happen more often than not. So all of that, when you have 12,000 government-run politicized monopolies, change doesn't happen easy. It requires opening up systems, changing laws, changing regulations. And so our foundations do the nitty-gritty work to be subject matter experts in a variety of different places to create a more innovative education system. It's a struggle. It's not easy work. It's not a photo op kind of foundation. It's policy oriented. And thankfully, we've had enough support to grow. We have 60 employees working across the country now. And I'm proud of the work they do.
Turning now to your 2016 campaign for the Republican presidential nomination, which you formally launched in June 2015. Could you tell us a bit about the early days of the campaign and what your experiences were from the primary and when you really saw Donald Trump becoming a threat?
Well, you'll be happy to know that I'm out of therapy now because of the 2016 election. I'm fully, yeah, it's all good. When did I know that Donald Trump had created kind of a unique situation? It was probably in the summer of 2015. So the primary process started in January of 2016. 2015, it was several months, I'd say 3 months after President Trump had gotten into the race. He got into the race the same time I did formally. We had done a lot of planning, a lot of working prior to that. But we launched our campaigns about the same time. And at first, it's hard because the guy broke every rule. He was ungrateful. He was mean-spirited. He attacked people for being war heroes or developmentally disabled. I mean, it's like incredible. Every rule book in terms of human decency, he broke. And I looked at it and said, man, how could anybody support someone like that? And the reality was there were a lot of people saying, hey, he's saying the things I can't say. I like his political incorrectness. And so he tapped into a deep anxiety. And all the other candidates, one of the problems was we had so many people running all at once. There was 18 candidates at one point, I think, that there was a dilution of the more traditional approach. And he kind of stood out even more because of that. So, but it was in the summer, I think, where it was clear that this was a unique kind of environment, and he was definitely a unique candidate. So anyway, I did my best. We had a great crew working on it. When it was clear to me that there was no way that he was going to lose the nomination, I got out. I got out in South Carolina. So it was after 4 of the first 4 primaries, and others should have gotten out as well. To be honest with you, there should have been I think Ted Cruz had kind of earned the position of being the second person, and he should have had a free rein to see if he could wrangle the nomination. I'm not sure he would have been able to do it, but he should have had that right, I think.
Could you tell us a bit about your endorsement of Ted Cruz?
I thought he was better than Donald Trump, and I didn't think anybody else was going to have come close to beating now President Trump. Mm-hmm. It was that simple. It's not anything more than that. It was, look, you when you introduced me, you said that I'm a frequent or constant critic of the president. I'm not a fan, for sure, but I do give him credit. I pray for him every day because I think we need to pray for our leaders, irrespective of whether you agree with them or not. And when his administration does good things, I'm supportive, and I will openly acknowledge that. So I'm not a never Trumper, like obsessed beyond belief. I've got a life, I've got a family, I've got a thriving business. So I'm literally out of therapy, as I said. So there are people that are so obsessed with the president that it changes their lives. It's just ridiculous. They need to get over it. Give him credit for the things he does that you agree with, and be critical of him when he does the wrong things. And that's the right approach, I think, in a democracy.
Which leads me very nicely onto my next question, actually, which is, as we begin to evaluate President Trump's first term, Do you think he's lived up to the fears of his critics and the hopes of his supporters?
I'd say it's mixed. If you're a conservative, you applaud many of the regulatory changes that he's made. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, there was I think President Obama at least, halfway through, but maybe even earlier, realized he couldn't work with the Republicans in Congress. So he used his executive powers through rulemaking and imposed a lot of rules that were probably overbearing for the economy. Pulling that back, I think he gets credit for. If you are a conservative and you believe that you believe in judges that don't try to legislate from the bench, but try to interpret the law based on precedent, you would applaud his judicial picks that have been pretty precedent-setting in terms of the number of judges. Tax cuts, if you believe those are important, there was a major tax relief for businesses and individuals. So there's some positive things, but I think in terms of the presidency itself, so to use the UK example, you have a prime minister and a queen. The presidency is both in the United States. It's the symbol of the country. It's the force of unity in the country, theoretically. And it's also, the presidency also has the prime ministerial duties. And so on the prime ministerial duties, as a conservative, the president, I think, gets passing grades. On his kingly duties, I would say he's abject failure. There's nothing unifying. There's no empathy for the plight of people. The disruptive nature of how he communicates is not helpful. And then finally, I'd say on foreign policy, it's mixed as well. There's some, I think the challenging of the ambitions of China is important, but pulling back from the responsibilities of leadership in the rest of the world, I think, is quite dangerous. So we'll see. And the trade policies, I think, haven't turned out to be what he said they were going to be. I think they're going to create some economic hardships for working people in our own country.
You've always been extremely vocal about the need for immigration reform in the United States.
Yep.
And in 2014, you referred to illegal immigration as an act of love and commitment to one's family. What do you make of the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration since 2016, which has really only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think sees migrants being detained or even turned away under the 1944 Public Health Act?
Yep. So first of all, what I said was taken somewhat out of context, in the sense that I said that most people crossing the southern border are coming to be able to provide for their families. It's an act of love when you provide for your families. I didn't say all immigrants or anything like that. And of course, in political life now, you can get clubbed for anything you say. But I do believe that still to this day. And I think the immigrant experience in the United States done right is a catalyst for so many good things historically in our country and can continue to be. I mean, just to go through some of the reasons why immigration is important, the demographic pyramid is inverted these days. We're all getting older, and younger people are forming families much later and having fewer children. Immigrants can provide a much more solid demographic base to deal with the social contract in our country. Legal immigrants form more families, they commit less crimes, they own more businesses, they own more patents. Seems like if you wanted to create a strategy for sustained economic growth, you would include immigration as part of that. I think we need to change our immigration laws, and I laid out a detailed plan. I wrote a book about it and laid out a detailed plan on how to do that. And we need to take it out of politics. It's now on both sides used as a wedge issue. I think the president is more egregious in the use of immigrants kind of as a political wedge issue, but the left does it as well. And so what we should see the benefits of this, restoring what it is to be an American citizen, having a set of shared values, embracing the immigrant experience as part of that. All of that is important. And it's obviously stalled out. There's very little consensus on how to move forward, and it's harmful for the long-term success of our country. The president using using the pandemic, situation to be able to create more rules, more restrictive rules on immigration is sad. I'll just leave it at that. It's just the wrong thing to be doing. This is a time to be embracing the plight of people rather than seizing, taking political advantage of something. This is the time to unify the country. We are literally, as you are, in quarantine. This is unprecedented. And you would hope that political leadership would, as many governors have, by the way, have put aside partisan differences and are working to be able to create the safest possible environment for all citizens and all residents of our country.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things the pandemic has seen, as you actually just mentioned, is an increase in the power and the significance of the role of the governor, with President Trump deferring a lot of responsibility and decisions surrounding public health to state authorities. Mm-hmm. What do you make of this renewed power of the governor, and do you think it is a prudent administrative policy?
I do, and it's always been there. The executive powers after a declaration of emergency has always been used. When I was governor, we had 8 hurricanes and 4 tropical storms in 16 months. We were preparing for a storm, recovering for a storm, all across the state over that period of time. And the executive authority was enhanced to be able to make that possible, to support local communities. I think the governors are the right place to develop strategies for reopening. And you can see that there are different approaches. In my own home state, Miami and Fort Lauderdale have higher infection rates than other parts of the state. Well, the other parts of the state, I think, legitimately should be reopened with all sorts of procedures in place to make sure that there isn't a spike in infections. But Miami-Dade and Fort Lauderdale, we should be a little slower in our approach. Similarly, if you're in Nebraska, which is a rural area, you focus on meatpacking plants or places where there's an aggregation of people. So having the governors play that role of understanding their states rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach, I think is important. Where the national government can come in is where they have in terms of providing massive financial support for people, for businesses. It's really hard to make a living when you can't sell your service or your product. And so I think that's a place where the federal government legitimately has a role to play. They should be playing a more constructive role as it relates to testing, because you have every state scrambling for limited supplies. The lessons learned on the pandemic is that we need to have a supply chain that is much less dependent upon China and more independent of being able to build out the inventories necessary to be successful. Mm-hmm. So there's the federal role, and then obviously the research and development for finding a vaccine is the federal government's responsibility along with the private sector. So I think it's good that governors are leading, and they've done it pretty well. I mean, it's everybody's got a little bit different style, but I think if you look at the polling, generally governors' numbers have gone significantly up, and the role of the federal government is not viewed as favorably.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, what do you make of President Trump's relationship with the mainstream media, especially during the pandemic and also throughout his presidency?
It's, he's like Dr. Pavlov, and the press is like the dog. He owns the press. It's incredible. The relationship obviously is not good, mm-hmm. but he enjoys the fight, and their coverage of him plays into his strength. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty interesting that after 4 years, you would think the press would make some adjustments to their relationship and not play into his hands, but they haven't. It's Pavlovian. It's really interesting what a master he is at dealing with the press, and the press itself is radically changed with digital media, with Twitter. I don't know when this is going to be broadcast, but he went into a tirade this last weekend that was like no president ever would have done that. And the press coverage of it, of course, just accentuates it. He owns them. It's pretty remarkable.
How else do you propose the press reacts, apart from kind of giving his?
I'd say, yeah, it's a good question. My advice is follow what he does, not what he says. Don't amplify the things that he says, but hold him to account for the things he does. That would be a good start. But he'll say something, and it's a distraction, and they'll just run. It's like I don't know if you play football, soccer. We call it soccer over here. It's like a 5-year-old. You ever seen 5-year-olds play soccer? They just follow the ball. So President Trump throws out the ball, and the press just follows him in an unorganized way. And he controls controls him in so many ways. And it's I think it would be more helpful to cover what he says, but cover more importantly what he does, and don't obsess about everything he does, because tomorrow he's going to say something different. The actions are what matters, and a more balanced approach I think would be helpful.
Just a very final question from me now before we take our last question from the audience. You've seen COVID-19 to be an opportunity when it comes to education, and you've started a series of online masterclasses called Class in Session with Jeb Bush. So could you tell us a bit about this initiative, and do you think it has a future beyond the pandemic?
I don't know. We're having fun with it. It's basically 20 minutes with people who's have had really interesting lives, and we get questions from students, and I ask questions as well. And it's a range of people. Condoleezza Rice, who to this day still practices piano for 2 hours a day, wanted to be a concert pianist and ended up being Secretary of State. Timothy Dolan, the Cardinal of New York, why he became a priest, and his family, the loving family existence life he had, and what impact that had. The manager of the Chicago Cubs, who was not a good team member according to his general manager, and rather than say, well, you're wrong, and kind of do what a lot of adults do, which is to be in complete denial, he reflected on the fact that he might not have been as good a team member as he needed to be, and became basically the iconic figure for the first World Series win for the Chicago Cubs, because he paused, and he changed kind of the direction of his own life. Jim Nantz is going to be on. My friend Romero Brito, who's an incredible pop artist that lives here in Miami. So we're doing a series of people whose life lessons, I think, can, during this period where we're sorting out, where we want to be in our lives going forward, there's kind of a pause button. It's good to talk to people and listen to people that have life experiences that should give people hope. And that's the point. I think we're living in we're told over and over again, this is a horrible time, and it is in many ways, but it's also a time, great things happen after disruptions. Great businesses are formed. Great inventions are created. Sir Isaac Newton figured out the laws of gravity when he was quarantined during one of the plagues. I mean, this is a time where, if we're smart about this, we'll come out of this far stronger in our communities, in our country, and in the world.
On that note, we turn to our very final question from the audience. This one is from Ed at Wardham, and he asks, as a Republican, how do you feel the Trump administration has dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic? Do you think the administration's response could reflect in the 2020 election result?
It definitely will reflect in the 2020 elections, for sure, because it's the dominant element of our lives right now. And the economic downturn that has taken place because of the pandemic, while you can't blame the president for that, is the backdrop for the election. So it's going to have a big impact. I think it's too early to say exactly how the federal government and the president's response to the pandemic will be viewed. I do think right now that people generally believe in the public health experts. They trust them, like to see more of them, and they seem to be more supportive of their governors. But But the other side of this is the president still dominates the news, and his opponent's in the basement of his house in Wilmington, Delaware. It's not a good look. And there's a lot of limitations in running an election during this time, and the president has the bully pulpits for sure. So he has certain advantages that may play out in November, but to the point of the question, it'll have a big impact. It's impossible to know in May what the environment will look like in November. There's too many uncertainties. If we get back to some degree of normality and the economy is coming back, people will be more hopeful, and that'll probably help the chances of the president. If we have a second wave that is devastating, that would hurt the president.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Governor Bush. It has been a pleasure hosting you.